The library at Halecrest University smells like expensive history-aged oak floor wax and the faint, unsettling scent of privilege. I prefer it that way. It is a neutral space where the weight of the air doesn't usually press against your lungs. Or so I thought. I had been sitting in the corner of the third floor for 45 minutes, my focus narrowing down to the economic policy frameworks of the post-war era. My pen moved in a steady rhythm, the tip scratching softly against the paper. The sound was my only anchor in a sea of silent high society students who treated the library like a runway. Then the air changed. It wasn't a sound, at least, not at first. It was a shift in pressure, a spike in the atmosphere that made the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Around me, the room shifted. A girl 2 tables over adjusted her posture, her spine snapping into a straight line of involuntary submission. An alpha near the window lowered his head, his hand hesitating over his keyboard. The silence, which had been peaceful, was now thick, suffocating, and heavy with pheromones. Dominic Vance had entered the room. He walked with the kind of confidence that didn't need to be loud to be heard. His footsteps, sharp, rhythmic strikes of leather against wood, echoed through the silent floor. The sharp clicks of his shoes sounded like a predator, moving through its territory, perfectly aware that every eye was on him, even if no one dared to look. My pen didn't stop, but my mind did. I paused the ink bleeding slightly into the expensive paper and reached for my notebook. Date October 12th. Subject Alpha Lead, Dominic Vance. Environmental impact, displacement of established comfort levels. Biological response, mandatory submission pheromones detected. Probability of threat to personal workflow high. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. I knew exactly where he was. He was the center of gravity in this room, the point around which every other student rotated. People were holding their breath, waiting for him to pick a table, waiting for him to demand space. He was the heir to the Vance Empire, the man whose name was whispered in the corridors like a local deity. He stopped. The footsteps ceased right in front of my desk. The sudden lack of sound was louder than any noise. The air around me felt like it was being vacuum sealed. I could feel the intense, focused weight of his gaze, the kind of look that was designed to force a response to demand that I acknowledge his presence. Any other Omega in this room would have been looking down, flushing with the synthetic hormones of fear or desperate interest. I, however, found the sudden drop in temperature interesting. I adjusted my glasses, finished my sentence, and finally deliberately looked up. Dominic Vance was exactly as the photos portrayed him, but more dangerous. His eyes were cold, searching, and entirely unbothered by the fact that the entire floor was staring at us. He looked like he was carved out of granite, a man who had never been told no in his entire life. "You're in my seat," he said. His voice was deep, smooth, and lacked any real warmth. It wasn't a request. It was an expectation. I glanced at the chair. No name tag, no signifier of ownership. I glanced back at his eyes, which were currently leaking enough dominant pheromones to make a lesser person faint. I didn't feel faint. I felt annoyed that my train of thought on international resource distribution had been derailed. "The table is public property," I replied, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor he was clearly used to hearing. "And there are 4 other empty chairs at this table. You're welcome to choose any of them." The entire library seemed to stop breathing. I could hear the sharp inhale of a student from across the aisle. This was the point where I was supposed to fold, apologize, and retreat. But I wasn't here for him. I was here for the degree. Dominic's expression didn't change. Not a flicker of surprise, not a hint of anger. He just stared at me, his gaze sharpening as if he were trying to dissect me, looking for the fear that I was clearly failing to provide. He leaned slightly over the table, his presence suddenly pressing into my space, heavy and sweet like overripe fruit. It was a test, a blatant biological power play. I took a deep breath, ignored the biological spike of my own nerves, and turned back to my notebook. I made one last entry in the margin, my handwriting crisp and legible. Observation alpha dominance is at its core a 20% waste of metabolic energy. It is a performative display with zero practical utility in an academic setting. Threat level remains at negligible. I looked back at him, meeting his eyes with a blank, polite expression. "If you're done testing the air quality, I have a paper to finish." He stood there for another 10 seconds, an eternity in the world of Halecrest. Then something happened. He didn't demand I move again. He didn't snap. Instead, he pulled out the chair directly across from me, the one I had pointed to, and sat down. The silence that returned to the library was different now. It was no longer a silence of submission. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. I didn't acknowledge him further. I went back to my reading, my pen returning to its steady rhythm, the tips scratching softly against the paper again. I could feel him watching me. I could feel the confusion radiating off the other students like heat from a radiator. By the time I left an hour later, the Halacrest gossip feed was already trending. I didn't check it, but the whispers followed me all the way to the lobby. "Did you see him?" Someone hissed. He didn't even blink. "That is the scholarship student, right? The one from Chicago." I walked out of the library, the cool Massachusetts air hitting my face, and checked my phone. One notification caught my eye. A rumor thread titled Dominic Vance versus the ghost student. I tucked my phone into my pocket. They were already connecting the dots, inventing a narrative where none existed. My lip curled in a thin, dry smile. If they wanted a story, they were going to be sorely disappointed. I was just here for the data. The rumor mill at Halacrest University was more efficient than any Wall Street trading floor. By 8 a.m. the next morning, the campus digital forums had compiled a 30-page thread dissecting my genetic makeup, my mother's non-existent history with the Vance family, and the exact mathematical probability of me being Dominic Vance's illegitimate brother. A 0.4% dip, Carter Rhodes said, sliding a tablet across the marble table of the campus cafe. He was a second-year beta, a scholarship student in journalism who treated campus gossip like a war correspondent treats frontline data. Vance Corp's stock dipped slightly after the European markets opened. In high finance, that is not a crash. It is a mild tremor, but the board hates tremors. I didn't look at the screen. I was busy measuring the exact amount of black coffee I needed to survive my 900 a.m. macroeconomics seminar. Correlation does not imply causation, Carter. The dip is likely due to the federal interest rate speculation, not a library dispute over a chair. They don't care about logic, Julian Carter whispered, leaning in. The cafe was buzzing with low-hummed conversations as students kept glancing toward our corner. They care about narrative. Look at you. You have the same posture, the same flat tone, the same refusal to react. People are already calling you the Vance Ghost. And worse, Sebastian Sterling is furious. Sebastian Sterling, Dominic's designated match? Carter said, his voice dropping another octave. A legacy family omega, the kind who treats marriage like a corporate merger. If you are a threat to that merger, you are a threat to his entire portfolio. I took a sip of my coffee. It was lukewarm and slightly bitter. Then Mr. Sterling needs to diversify his assets. 2 hours later, I found myself in the basement corridor of the Old Quad. A quiet, low-traffic hallway, lined with locked archives and the heavy, damp smell of stone. My footsteps echoed in a steady, slow rhythm as my shoes tapped against the stone. Then the rhythm was broken. A shadow fell across the flagstones. Dominic Vance stood near the exit, his tall frame cutting off the dim light from the high leaded window. He wasn't wearing his formal jacket today, just a dark cashmere sweater, but his sheer presence still made the narrow corridor feel suffocatingly small. I stopped 5 paces away. The silence between us was heavy, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic ticking of his watch, a vintage Rolex, its mechanical heartbeat steady and precise ticking quietly in the silence. "You're hard to find," Julian Dominic said. His voice was lower than yesterday, vibrating slightly against the stone walls. "I have a schedule to maintain, Mr. Vance," I replied, adjusting the strap of my messenger bag. "And unlike you, I do not have a driver waiting to offset my tardiness." "The board is asking questions," he said, ignoring my remark. He stepped closer. The faint scent of cedarwood and cold rain began to edge into my personal space. It wasn't an aggressive display of pheromones, not yet, but it was a boundary test. My father's public relations team spent 3 hours this morning drafting a denial of your existence. They should save their ink, I said, pulling my tablet from my bag. I have already drafted a response. Dominic paused, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. A response. A SWOT analysis, I said, tapping the screen and turning it toward him. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. If you deny the rumor immediately, you validate it. The media will assume a cover-up. Your father's stock will experience another minor fluctuation. Sebastian Sterling's family will push for an accelerated engagement to stabilize the narrative. I pointed to the opportunities quadrant on the digital sheet. However, if we lean into the rumor specifically, if we perform a highly public hostile sibling rivalry, we create a different asset. Dominic didn't take the tablet. He simply stared at the screen, then at me. His gaze was analytical, stripped of the usual alpha arrogance. Explain. You want to delay your engagement to Sterling. A public family feud over inheritance or identity makes you look volatile, unfit for a stable merger right now. It buys you time. I explained, my tone as dry as if I were presenting a classroom slide. In exchange, I receive the Vance Shield. No alpha on this campus will dare approach an Omega who might be the illegitimate son of the patriarch. I get peace to finish my degree. You get a weapon to stall your family. The silence returned. The ticking of his watch seemed louder now, filling the quiet space. A fake sibling feud, Dominic murmured. The corner of his mouth twitched a micro-expression of amusement that lasted less than a second. An Omega playing an aggressive, disowned brother. It is absurd. Absurdity is highly effective in distracting the public from actual facts, Mr. Vance, I replied. I have drafted a standard non-disclosure agreement. It is on the second tab. No physical contact, no actual sharing of assets, and the agreement terminates the day I receive my diploma. Dominic reached out his fingers, brushing the edge of the tablet as he took it. His hand was warm, but his touch was light, respecting the boundary. He swiped through the document, his eyes reflecting the blue light of the screen. You're a strange Omega Julian, he said quietly. I am an expensive investment, Mr. Vance. I intend to see a return on my tuition. He tapped his digital signature at the bottom of the screen. The soft electronic chime of the confirmation was the only seal we needed. The performance begins tomorrow, Dominic said, handing the tablet back. Do not miss your cue. I am never late, I said. The next morning, the central courtyard of Halecrest was packed with students enjoying the autumn sun. Sebastian Sterling sat at a wooden table near the fountain, surrounded by a court of high-ranking Omegas. He looked like an advertisement for old wealth, perfectly pressed white shirt, a scent of sweet jasmine so heavily curated it felt synthetic. I walked toward the library, a paper cup of coffee in my hand. From the opposite side of the courtyard, Dominic Vance appeared. He walked with his usual predator's stride, but his jaw was set coldly. The crowd around the fountain went quiet, sensing the drop in atmospheric pressure. As I passed the fountain, Dominic stepped directly into my path. The silence in the courtyard was absolute. Even the water from the fountain seemed to splash louder. Without a word, Dominic reached out, snatched the coffee cup directly from my hand, and dropped it into the iron trash bin beside us. The splash of hot liquid against the metal was loud and sharp. You don't belong on this side of the campus, Dominic said, his voice carrying clearly across the stone courtyard. His pheromones flared cold, oppressive, and heavy with a manufactured hatred. Keep your distance, Julian. I didn't flinch. I let my shoulder drop slightly, my gaze hardening into a cold, clinical glare that mirrored his own perfectly. I looked him dead in the eyes, ignoring the collective gasp of the students behind us. The space is public, Dominic, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. And unlike you, I actually have to earn my place here. Don't touch my things again. I turned and walked away, my boots striking the stone pavement in a steady, unbroken rhythm. Behind me, I could hear the immediate frantic whispering of the crowd. In the reflection of the library's glass doors, I saw Sebastian Sterling leaning forward, his eyes locked on my retreating figure with a look of pure, toxic curiosity. The contract had been signed. The stage was set. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just observing the ecosystem, I was controlling it. The performance was a masterclass in applied behavioral psychology. For the next 3 weeks, Halecrest was treated to the daily, highly calculated spectacle of the Vance family civil war. We staged our conflicts with the precision of a military campaign. On a Tuesday in the crowded main dining hall, Dominic accidentally knocked a stack of my research papers to the floor, his eyes dark with manufactured disdain. On a Thursday, I publicly refused to step into an elevator with him, stating loudly that the air quality was already compromised. Our most successful maneuver occurred in the central library. I slammed a heavy textbook onto the table, leaning in so close that our noses almost brushed. You are sacrificing long-term yield for short-term leverage, and it is pathetic. I practically snarled, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Dominic slammed his hand on the wood, leaning back into my space. It is a calculated risk, something a coward hiding behind textbooks wouldn't understand. The crowd around us gasped collectively, holding their breath. The campus forums immediately exploded with theories about how we were fighting over Vance Corp's newly acquired European assets. In reality, we were arguing over a theoretical game theory model for my macroeconomics midterm. Dominic favored aggressive expansion, I preferred market stabilization, but the audience didn't need to know the variables, they only needed the visuals. However, a psychological phenomenon occurs when you pretend to hate someone for a prolonged period. It requires proximity, and proximity breeds familiarity. The fifth floor archive room became our designated safe zone. It was off limits to underclassmen, poorly lit, and smelled of decaying paper and dust. It was the only place on campus where the performance stopped. I was sitting on the floor between two towering shelves of legal periodicals cross-referencing a federal law case. The heavy polished oak door clicked shut. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. The faint, crisp scent of cedarwood cut through the smell of old paper. It wasn't the aggressive, dominant pheromone cloud Dominic used to clear hallways. It was quiet, restrained. Dominic sat down on the floor opposite me, his long legs stretched out in the narrow aisle. He didn't say a word. He just set a paper cup on the floor and slid it across the wooden boards. I stopped writing. I looked at the cup, then at him. Black. Exact temperature. Dominic set his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet room. He pulled out his own laptop and began typing. I picked up the coffee. The warmth seeped into my cold fingers. I took a sip. It was perfect. I reached for my pen and opened my notebook to the back pages where the real data was kept. Date November 18th. Subject Dominic Vance. Day 28 of the agreement. Side effect of cooperation. Subject has initiated a routine of providing caffeine. Biological response. My cortisol levels have dropped by an estimated 15% in his presence. Conclusion. Initial threat assessment was flawed. Safe distance parameters require immediate reevaluation. I stared at the ink drying on the page. It was a statistical anomaly. I was an omega biologically wired to feel either submission or intense stress around an alpha of his caliber. Instead, the steady clacking of his laptop keys was acting like a metronome, grounding my focus. I found myself looking at my notebook less and looking at the sharp lines of his profile more. The shift was terrifying precisely because it was so silent. A week later, late November brought a brutal Massachusetts storm to the campus. The wind howled through the stone courtyards, and heavy rain lashed against the library's leaded windows in a relentless, chaotic rhythm of rain and wind smacking against the glass. I had been in the archives for 9 hours straight, fueled by nothing but black coffee and pure spite for my upcoming finals. The text on my screen was beginning to blur into meaningless shapes. My head felt heavy. I rested my forehead against my crossed arms on the desk just for a moment, just to reset my visual baseline. I didn't intend to sleep, but the storm outside was loud and the quiet breathing of the alpha sitting across from me was steady. My systems shut down. I don't know how long I was out. I drifted back to consciousness, slowly pulled upward by a shift in temperature. The chill of the drafty archive room was gone, replaced by a profound, enveloping warmth. I kept my eyes closed, my senses processing the data before my brain could. The weight over my shoulders was heavy, soft, and smelled intensely of cedarwood and cold rain. It was a scent that had no trace of aggression. It was pure, unfiltered protection. I opened my eyes slowly. Dominic's dark cashmere coat was draped over me, covering my shoulders and back entirely. I looked up. Dominic was standing by the window, his back to me, watching the storm. He was in his shirt sleeves, his posture relaxed, his usual armor completely discarded. My heart did something highly irregular against my ribs. A sudden sharp spike. Variable unknown. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat there beneath the weight of his coat, letting the warmth rewrite every logical theorem I had built to survive this school. Then, from the dark corridor just outside the archive's slightly ajar door, a sound cut through the noise of the rain. A sharp click cut through the noise of the rain. It was the unmistakable artificial shutter sound of a smartphone camera. Dominic's head snapped toward the door instantly, his spine stiffening, his pheromones spiking into a sharp, icy warning. He crossed the room in 3 strides and yanked the door open. The corridor was empty, but as I pulled the cashmere coat tighter around my shoulders, I inhaled sharply. Drifting through the open doorway, cutting through the smell of dust and rain, was the heavy, synthetic scent of sweet jasmine. Sebastian Sterling had been there, and the script had just been violently altered. The Hallicrest Winter Charity Gala was an exercise in extreme excess. Held in the grand ballroom of the historical alumni building, the space was a suffocating mix of crystal chandeliers, velvet drapery, and a concentrated cluster of the East Coast's most powerful families. The auditory environment was a carefully curated wall of sound. The low, thrumming bass of a live jazz quartet blended perfectly with the clinking of champagne flutes and the modulated, practiced laughter of the elite. I hated it. I was standing in a shadowed alcove near the terrace doors, counting down the minutes until my mandatory attendance time was fulfilled. At 4:45 p.m., the first anomaly occurred. It started as a minor fluctuation in my core body temperature, a flush of heat at the base of my neck. I adjusted my collar, mentally calculating the ambient temperature of the room. It was warm, but not unusually so. Then my pulse spiked. My smartwatch vibrated lightly against my wrist, indicating a heart rate elevated to 115 BPM and asking if I was exercising. I wasn't moving, but my lungs felt suddenly tight, struggling to pull oxygen from the perfume-heavy air. My breathing grew shallow, the rhythm chaotic. The sound of my own desperate, ragged respiration began to drown out the jazz band. A heavy, aching weight settled low in my abdomen. My biological systems were initiating a cascade failure. My mind raced through the data. Symptoms: elevated temperature, tachycardia, hyperventilation, pheromone unbinding. Conclusion: heat cycle. But that was scientifically impossible. I had taken my suppressants at exactly 700 a.m. as I had done every day for the past 4 years. The dosage was precise. The efficacy rate was 99.9%, unless the variable wasn't the biology but the chemical itself. Placebos. I gripped the edge of the marble table, my knuckles turning white. Through the blurring vision, I scanned the ballroom. Across the sea of tailored suits and silk gowns, standing next to a towering ice sculpture, was Sebastian Sterling. He was holding a glass of champagne, his eyes locked directly on my corner. He wasn't smiling, but the synthetic, suffocating scent of sweet jasmine suddenly felt incredibly loud. He had switched my medication. He wanted a public biological breakdown to prove I was just another unstable omega, unfit for the Vance name. The barrier holding back my natural scent snapped. I didn't smell like paper or clinical suppressants anymore. I smelled like distress, fear, and raw, unshielded omega. The reaction in the ballroom was instantaneous. Heads snapped in my direction. The polite conversation died. I could feel the predatory, heavy gaze of a dozen alphas locking onto my coordinates, their own pheromones spiking in aggressive, involuntary response. I was prey in a room full of wolves, and I couldn't move my legs. Then a sound cut through the rising panic. A loud crash echoed, the sharp, violent sound of a crystal champagne flute shattering against the marble floor echoed like a gunshot. The crowd parted violently. Dominic Vance moved through the space, not with his usual calculated grace, but with terrifying, singular momentum. The alphas who had taken a step toward me froze, choked by the sudden freezing atmospheric pressure. Dominic didn't release a wave of dominant pheromones to challenge them. He did something far more dangerous. He pulled his scent entirely inward, creating a void, a black hole of pure, lethal intent. It wasn't a biological display of dominance, it was a promise of absolute destruction for anyone who stepped closer. He reached me in seconds. His jaw was locked so tightly a muscle twitched beneath his skin, and his dark eyes were burning. But his hands, when they touched my trembling shoulders, were incredibly steady. He didn't speak. He stripped off his heavy bespoke suit jacket and threw it over my head, draping it entirely over my shoulders and pulling it tight across my chest. The world went dark. The scent of panic and aggressive alphas vanished instantly, replaced by the overwhelming grounding aroma of cedarwood and cold rain. He picked me up, one arm under my knees, the other wrapping securely around my back. I buried my face into his neck, my hands clutching his crisp dress shirt. He carried me straight through the center of the ballroom, ignoring the gasps, the whispers, and Sebastian Sterling's stunned face. The drive to his private penthouse in downtown Boston was a blur of neon lights and the frantic rhythm of my own heart. I was burning from the inside out, the biological imperative screaming at me to submit to the alpha sitting rigid beside me. But Dominic didn't touch me. He sat with his hands clenched on his knees, staring straight ahead, his breathing as tightly controlled as a machine. When we reached the penthouse, he carried me inside, bypassed the bedroom entirely, and set me down gently on the cold tiles of the hallway floor. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice raw, rough, and vibrating with an agonizing level of restraint. He stepped backward into the adjacent bathroom. The door slammed shut. The lock clicked. Seconds later, the heavy sound of high-pressure water hitting the shower floor echoed through the apartment. He had turned it on ice cold. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, leaning my back against the locked bathroom door. My body was trembling violently, racked by the fever of the heat, biological tears streaming silently down my face. With shaking hands, I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the Notes app. My thumbs kept slipping on the glass screen, but I forced the words out, fighting my own biology to maintain a grip on reality. Date December 15th. Subject Dominic Vance. System warning, critical logic error. The subject's proximity is not triggering submissive panic. His restraint is counter-biological. Conclusion, his pheromones are not a threat. They are a safe haven. Variables cannot be calculated. I dropped the phone on the tile. Through the heavy oak door, I could hear the rush of the cold shower, and beneath that the ragged, heavy breathing of an alpha fighting his own nature just to keep me safe. I pulled his cashmere jacket tighter around my shivering body. I was in the middle of a biological crisis, crying on a bathroom floor. But as I leaned my head back against the wood separating us, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. I had never felt safer in my entire life. The biological storm broke at precisely 5:14 a.m. Thanks to the emergency high-grade suppressants Dominic had managed to procure through a private medical contact, my system finally rebooted. I woke up on the massive leather sofa in his penthouse, wrapped tightly in his heavy cashmere blanket. I was alone. The penthouse was dead silent. The faint scent of cedarwood was the only proof that the night hadn't been a fever hallucination. I sat up, my muscles aching as if I had run a marathon, and reached for my phone on the glass coffee table. The screen lit up with an avalanche of notifications. The Halacrest digital ecosystem was in absolute meltdown. Trending number 1, the Vance Air and the Omega. Trending number 2, medical emergency at charity gala. Trending number 3, Sebastian Sterling leaves in disgust. But the most concerning data point wasn't on the student forums. It was on the financial ticker. Vance Corp's stock had opened with a sharp, brutal 4.2% drop. In the world of elite finance, a rumor of a sibling rivalry was a tremor. A public, unexplainable biological incident involving the sole heir and an undocumented Omega was an earthquake. For the next 3 days, I didn't see Dominic. He didn't return to the penthouse, and I didn't reach out. I packed my bag, took an Uber back to my dorm, and spent 72 hours drafting damage control matrices. I built spreadsheets calculating the optimal PR narrative, legal defense strategies regarding my medical records, and statistical probabilities of expulsion. I was trying to calculate my way out of an emotional crisis. It was the only defense mechanism I had left. On Thursday afternoon, a single text message appeared on my encrypted messaging app. Main library, 3rd floor, 4:00 p.m. I arrived at 3:55 p.m. The atmosphere in the library was vastly different from my first day. The students didn't just look at me, they stared. Their gazes were heavy with judgment, curiosity, and a predatory anticipation. They were waiting for the execution. Dominic was already sitting at our corner table. He looked pristine. He was wearing a dark bespoke suit. His tie perfectly knotted, his posture rigid. As I approached, the first thing I noticed was the audio data. The library was deathly quiet, amplifying the mechanical heartbeat of his vintage Rolex ticking relentlessly. The second thing I noticed was the air quality. It was sterile. Dominic had completely locked down his pheromones. There was no cedarwood, no rain, no warmth. It was a suffocating, manufactured void. I sat down in the chair across from him. I opened my messenger bag and pulled out my tablet. I've drafted 3 viable narratives to counter the fallout from the gala. If we frame the incident as a severe allergic reaction to the synthetic floral arrangements... "Stop," Dominic said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the air like a scalpel. I froze, my fingers hovering over the glass screen. I looked up. Dominic's eyes were completely opaque. The dark, intense gaze that had watched me sleep in the archives, the gaze that had anchored me through a biological panic, was gone. I was looking at the heir to the Vance empire. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and slid a single sheet of heavy watermarked paper across the wooden table. I didn't need to read the fine print. It was our non-disclosure agreement, the contract we had signed in the damp corridor of the old quad. Across the bottom, stamped in bold, unyielding red ink, was a single word: terminated. The board held an emergency meeting on Tuesday. Dominic said, his voice flat, devoid of any fluctuation. My father has issued an ultimatum. The engagement with Sebastian Sterling will be officially announced to the press tomorrow morning at 9:00 a.m. I stared at the red stamp. The mechanical ticking of his watch seemed to grow louder, ticking away the seconds. In exchange, Dominic continued his tone as clinical as a corporate merger. The Vance legal team will not pursue federal charges against you for medical fraud, identity manipulation, and corporate extortion. My head snapped up. Corporate extortion, the sibling rumor, Dominic said coldly. We allowed it to run. Now my family's legal department is fully prepared to frame you as a grifter who orchestrated the entire narrative to extort shares from Vance Corp. You would face expulsion, a ruined academic record, and potentially prison time. That is mathematically absurd, I said, my voice rising slightly, fighting against the sudden sharp restriction in my throat. We signed a mutual agreement. You benefited from the delay. An agreement that currently does not exist, Dominic replied. He leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on the table. You are a liability, Julian. The performance was highly entertaining, and it served its purpose for a time. But the variables have changed. The returns no longer justify the investment. He was using my words. The exact terminology I had used on our first day. Investment, return, liability. He was dismantling my logic using my own weapons. I scanned his face. I searched his micro-expressions. I looked for the muscle twitch in his jaw, the slight softening of the eyes, anything to indicate that this was a lie, a protective maneuver. But he gave me nothing. He was an impenetrable stone fortress. Is that your conclusion, Mr. Vance? I asked, my voice terrifyingly quiet. Or your father's? It is the only logical conclusion, Dominic said. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with fluid, practiced grace. He looked down at me, his expression perfectly blank. You said it yourself on day one. I calculate yield. And you, Julian, are currently yielding a net loss. Do not attempt to contact me again. He turned and walked away. The sound of his leather shoes striking the oak floor echoed through the silent library with heavy clicks. It was the sound of a predator leaving a territory it no longer cared to claim. I watched his broad back disappear down the stairwell. I sat alone at the table. The silence rushed back in deafening and heavy. I picked up my pen. I opened my notebook to a blank page. I needed to write this down. I needed to classify this event. Subject Dominic Vance. Status contract terminated. Threat level 0. I pressed the pen to the paper. I tried to force my brain to process the data logically, but my hand was trembling violently. The ink blurred. The pen tip caught on the expensive paper, tearing a jagged line straight through the page. System warning, critical logic error. The variable wasn't the contract. The variable wasn't the Vance Empire. The variable was him. And as a hot, uncalculated tear dropped onto the torn paper, I realized the terrifying truth of my own equation. I had fallen in love with him, and I had lost. The formal disciplinary hearing was held in the Sterling Hall of Jurisprudence, an architectural space designed specifically for intimidation. High vaulted ceilings, dark mahogany panels, and elevated seating for the tribunal ensured that whoever stood at the defendant's podium felt exceptionally small. I did not feel small. I felt hyper-focused. I stood alone at the center podium. Spread out before me were 300 pages of indexed, cross-referenced legal documents. I had spent the last 96 hours running statistical probabilities, studying federal biological privacy laws, and building an impenetrable fortress of data. If the Vance Empire wanted to crush me, they would have to bleed for every inch. The hall was packed. The gallery was a sea of elite students reporters from the university paper and board members. The ambient noise was a hungry hum of whispers buzzing through the crowd. They were waiting for a slaughter. At the center of the tribunal table sat Sebastian Sterling. His posture was perfectly erect, a smug, manufactured expression of pity plastered across his face. Even from 20 feet away, the synthetic, cloying scent of sweet jasmine drifted down toward me, heavy with preemptive victory. Mr. Hayes, the presiding board member, began, his voice amplified by the microphone. You stand accused of severe violations of the Hallicrest Honor Code, specifically medical fraud, manipulation of biological identity, and orchestrating a malicious rumor regarding the Vance family to extort financial and academic leverage. The accusations are factually incorrect, I replied, my voice steady, carrying clearly across the massive room without a microphone. I tapped the first stack of papers. According to Federal Statute 402B Section 4, an Omega's choice of suppressants and the resulting scent profile is protected medical data. It cannot be classified as fraud under any institutional guideline. Furthermore, regarding the rumor of extortion, I looked directly at Sebastian. I didn't blink. A rumor requires an origin point, I continued coldly. I have tracked the IP addresses of the initial forum posts regarding the Vance ghost theory. 62% of them originated from servers physically located within the Sterling family's off-campus housing. The gallery erupted into a sharp crescendo of gasps. Sebastian's jaw tightened, the smugness fracturing for a fraction of a second. The presiding judge slammed his wooden gavel 3 times loudly. "Order! Mr. Hayes, you cannot deflect these charges with baseless cybermetrics. We have signed affidavits." The heavy reinforced oak doors at the back of the hall did not just open, they were violently breached. A massive crash echoed through the vaulted ceiling like a cannon shot. The gavel froze mid-air. The whispers in the gallery died instantly. The atmospheric pressure in the room dropped so precipitously that my ears actually popped. Dominic Vance walked down the center aisle. He was not wearing his bespoke suit jacket. He wore a simple black dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He wasn't projecting a cloud of dominant pheromones to announce his presence. He didn't need to. The sheer, lethal momentum of his stride forced the gallery into absolute silence. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at me. His dark eyes were locked entirely on the tribunal. He walked past my podium, leaving the faint grounding scent of cedarwood in his wake, and stopped directly in front of the elevated mahogany table. He looked up at the board members and finally at Sebastian Sterling. "Mr. Vance," the presiding judge stammered, visibly sweating. "This is a closed hearing. The Vance legal team has already submitted their documents." "I am not here representing the Vance legal team," Dominic interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a cold vibrating resonance that commanded absolute obedience. He raised his right hand. On his index finger was the heavy, solid gold Vance family signet ring, the ultimate symbol of his inheritance, his status, and his future as the patriarch of a billion-dollar empire. With a slow, deliberate movement, Dominic pulled the ring off his finger. He held it over the mahogany table for a fraction of a second, then he let it go. The heavy gold ring clacked sharply against the wood and spun with a metallic ringing before coming to a halt. It was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of a dynasty being severed. Sebastian Sterling shot up out of his chair, his face entirely devoid of color. "Dominic, what are you doing?" "Your father." My father, Dominic, said, his tone razor sharp, "has been informed that I am officially liquidating my position within Vance Corp. I have surrendered my shares, my trust, and my place in the succession line." The gallery exploded. Reporters scrambled for their phones. The noise was deafening, a chaotic wave of shock, panic, and disbelief. But I couldn't hear any of it. My heart rate, which I had so carefully controlled, spiked erratically, variables crashing, logic failing. He had done it. He had actually burned his own empire to the ground. Dominic turned around, placing his back to the tribunal, completely dismissing them as a threat. He faced the gallery, his dark eyes sweeping over the hundreds of stunned faces before finally coming to rest on me. "Julian Hayes is not a Vance," Dominic said, his voice cutting through the chaos with terrifying clarity. "He has never asked for a single cent, a single favor, or a single drop of protection from my family." He took a step toward me. The cold, impenetrable fortress that had defined Dominic Vance for his entire life began to melt. "He doesn't carry the Vance name," Dominic finished, stopping less than a foot away from me. The corner of his mouth curved upward. "But he is the only person on this earth I will ever offer it to." Sebastian Sterling let out a ragged, humiliated breath and stormed out of the side exit, his entourage scrambling behind him. The tribunal was in absolute disarray. The flashing lights of smartphone cameras reflected off the vaulted ceiling like a strobe light. But in the center of the room, standing at the defendant's podium, the noise faded away. Dominic looked down at me. The scent of rain and cedarwood wrapped around me, warm and infinitely safe. He didn't emit a single ounce of alpha dominance. He just raised his hand, his fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair away from my forehead. It was the first time I had ever seen him smile, a genuine, uncalculated smile. "Your heart rate is elevated, Julian," he murmured, his voice incredibly soft, meant only for my ears. I looked up at him, my vision blurring my throat tight. I closed my eyes, leaning slightly into the warmth of his hand. "It is a biological anomaly," I whispered back, my voice trembling for the very first time. "The data requires further study." "Take all the time you need," Dominic said. The contract was dead. The ecosystem was shattered. And as the chaotic world of Hailcrest collapsed around us, I finally realized that the safest place in the universe was right here, standing in the ruins with him. 6 months is a statistically insignificant amount of time in the grand timeline of human history, but in the micro-ecosystem of Hailcrest University, 6 months was enough time for an entire paradigm shift. Spring had arrived in Massachusetts. The brutal howling winter storms had been replaced by a soft, steady April rain. The heavy snowmelt washed the ancient stone courtyards clean, and with the changing of the seasons came the shifting of the university's power dynamics. Sebastian Sterling had quietly transferred to a highly exclusive private university in Geneva just 3 weeks after the tribunal. The official narrative was an enrichment of international studies, but everyone knew he was fleeing the sheer, unmitigated humiliation of Dominic's public rejection. As for Dominic, the fallout was absolute. His father had made good on his threat. Dominic was formally stripped of his shares, his trust fund was frozen, and his name was systematically scrubbed from Vance Corp's succession planning. The financial media had a field day for exactly 14 days analyzing the tragedy of the fallen heir before the relentless news cycle moved on to the next corporate drama. They thought he was ruined. They didn't understand the variables. Dominic didn't just survive the fallout, he thrived in it. Without the suffocating weight of his family's expectations, the manufactured alpha aggression vanished completely. He traded the sprawling downtown penthouse for a modest 2-bedroom apartment near the campus perimeter. He sold the vintage Rolex and bought a high-processing server stack. For the past 5 months, he had been quietly building a predictive analytics startup, utilizing my economic stabilization models as the foundational algorithm. We were no longer a fake sibling rivalry. We were co-founders. I sat at the corner table on the 3rd floor of the Central Library. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaded glass windows, casting long, warm, geometric shadows across the oak wood. The auditory environment was perfect. There were no hushed, frantic whispers. There was no oppressive, heavy silence waiting for an apex predator to claim his territory. There was only the gentle, rhythmic sound of rain against the glass pattering softly, and the steady, rhythmic clacking of laptop keys. Dominic was sitting across from me. He was wearing a faded gray MIT sweatshirt, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, revealing the sharp, corded muscles of his forearms. He wore a pair of blue light-blocking glasses, his dark eyes focused entirely on the lines of code scrolling across his screen. The air around him was entirely devoid of dominant pheromones. Instead, there was just the faint, natural, incredibly grounding scent of cedarwood and rain. I stopped typing. I looked away from my macroeconomics thesis and just watched him for a moment. My heart rate was resting at a steady, healthy 72 BPM. My cortisol levels were practically non-existent. According to every biological marker, I was experiencing a sustained state of optimal security. I reached into my messenger bag and pulled out my old leather-bound notebook. The spine was worn, the edges frayed from months of being carried through the trenches of Hailcrest's social warfare. I opened it to the very first page. There it was, my initial entry written on that very first day when he had stood over this exact table trying to intimidate me with his sheer biological presence. Observation: alpha dominance is at its core a 20% waste of metabolic energy. It is a performative display with zero practical utility in an academic setting. Threat level remains at negligible. I stared at the faded ink. Then I reached for a red pen. With a single decisive motion, I drew a thick red line straight through the word negligible. I turned to the final blank page of the notebook. The paper was smooth and unblemished. I clicked my pen, the sharp sound making Dominic pause his typing. He didn't look up, but I knew he was listening. I pressed the pen to the paper and began to write the final entry of my behavioral study. Date April 14th. Day 215. Subject Dominic Vance. Status officially disinherited, stripped of corporate power. The subject has lost all mechanisms of traditional intimidation. New functional analysis, optimal partner. He no longer dictates the environment, he shares it. Risk assessment. I paused my pen, hovering over the paper. I felt a shift in the air. Dominic had closed his laptop. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The cedarwood scent grew slightly warmer, wrapping around my senses like a heavy protective blanket. He looked at my notebook, his dark eyes reading the upside-down text with practiced ease. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was the kind of smile that didn't need to conquer a boardroom, it only needed to conquer me. "You're struggling with a conclusion," Dominic noted quietly, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "I am ensuring the data is scientifically accurate," I replied, keeping my expression perfectly flat, though my pulse had just ticked up to a very unscientific 85 BPM. Dominic reached across the wooden table. He didn't use force. He didn't demand compliance. He simply slid his hand over mine, his warm fingers gently prying the red pen from my grasp. He set the pen down on the table with a soft tap. Then he turned my hand over and intertwined his fingers perfectly with mine. His grip was firm, anchoring me to the present moment, erasing the chaotic world outside the library walls. "Let me help you with the final variable," Dominic murmured, his thumb brushing lightly against my pulse point. I looked at our intertwined hands, then up into his dark, endlessly deep eyes. The logical structures in my brain, the firewalls I had built to survive my entire life, quietly and beautifully powered down. I didn't need them anymore. "Proceed," I whispered. I didn't need to write down the final risk assessment. I already knew the answer. The equation was perfectly balanced. Risk assessment highly addictive, and entirely worth it. We sat there in the quiet corner of the library, two anomalies who had broken the system content to simply exist in the beautiful, uncalculated silence of a brand new world.